The day Amos Walker drove the last nail into the porch railing of his almost finished farmhouse, a wagon rolled down the long dust-red road toward his property, and everything he had spent 7 years building suddenly felt both incomplete and more meaningful than it ever had before. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas plains were waking up from a long, gray winter. The grass was pushing through the cracked earth in thin green ribbons, and the sky above Hays City stretched out wide and pale blue, the kind of sky that made a man feel small but not insignificant. Amos was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled at his temples when the heat came on, and hands that told the story of every year he had spent out here. Calloused, scarred at the knuckles, browned deep by seasons of sun. He stood on the porch he had just finished and watched the wagon come. He had not been expecting company. The wagon was pulled by a single bay mare that moved with the tired, patient dignity of an animal that had been walking for a very long time. Seated on the board was a woman who held the reins with the kind of quiet competence that suggested she had been doing it for days, not hours. She wore a brown traveling dress that had once been the color of good soil but had been faded and dusted to something closer to ash. Her hair was dark, pulled back at the nape of her neck, though several strands had come loose and drifted around her face in the warm morning wind. She was not looking at the farmhouse. She was looking at the road ahead of her, and her jaw was set with a determination that Amos could see clearly even from 50 yards away. He stepped off the porch. She pulled the mare to a stop when he was about 20 feet from the wagon, and she looked down at him with eyes the color of dark river water, brown with flecks of amber that caught the morning light. She looked tired, not the kind of tired that a night's sleep fixes, the kind of tired that comes from long decisions and longer roads. "Is this the Walker property?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but there was something careful in it, the way a person speaks when they are trying not to show how much is riding on the answer. "It is," Amos said. She reached into the leather satchel beside her on the board and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out toward him, and he walked forward and took it. It was a letter. His letter, or rather, the letter he had written to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis 4 months ago, before he had talked himself out of sending it, and then talked himself back into it at 2 in the morning with a glass of whiskey, and a loneliness so heavy it felt like a second body in the room with him. He had written that he was a rancher building a homestead outside Hays City, that he was serious and steady, that he had land and a home near completion, and needed a woman of character to share it with. He had described the house in careful detail, the 2 bedrooms, the wide kitchen, the porch that faced east to catch the morning. He had said he was not a man given to fancy words, but that he had worked hard and intended to keep working hard, and that he believed a life built honest and shared was worth more than most things a man could chase. He had not expected anyone to answer quite so quickly. "I am Matilda Whitaker," she said. "I wrote back to the agency 3 weeks ago. I was told you would receive word before I arrived." Amos looked up from the letter. "I did not receive word." Something flickered across her face. Not quite hurt, not quite surprise, more like the quiet resignation of a woman who had learned not to be shocked when things did not go as planned. "I see," she said. "That does not mean you are not welcome," Amos said. He folded the letter carefully and held it back out to her. "It only means I was not prepared. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the letter back and tucked it into her satchel with the deliberate, unhurried motion of someone who has decided something. "All right," she said. He helped her down from the wagon. Her hand in his was small but firm, and she did not lean on him more than necessary. When her boots hit the Kansas dirt, she looked up at the farmhouse, and Amos watched her face while she looked at it. He was braced, in the way he had been bracing himself for years, for the expression that said it was not enough. The house was 2 stories at the front, though the second story was only half complete, the framing visible where the roof had not yet been shingled above the east room. The porch was new, the board still pale and unstained. The main structure was solid, built from limestone cut from the draws east of town and timber hauled up from Ellsworth. The kitchen window had glass panes he had ordered from a catalog at considerable expense. There was a barn behind, and beyond the barn, 40 acres of plowed field waiting on planting, and beyond that, open grassland that rolled away south toward the creek. Matilda Whitaker looked at all of it. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand rather than judge. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Mostly," Amos said. "My neighbor Roy Alcott helped me with the limestone work. And a man named Eli Shores, who came through looking for work 2 summers back, put in the better part of a month on the framing." "How long have you been at it?" He pushed his hat back on his head. 7 years, more or less. I came out here in '71 with a land claim and $140. The first 2 years I lived in a soddy while I cleared and fenced. The house started in '73. She turned and looked at him. 7 years, she said quietly, as though she were placing the number somewhere important. "I wanted to have something worth offering before I asked someone to share it," he said. He had not meant to say it quite that plainly, but it came out that way, and he let it stand. Matilda Whitaker looked back at the house, and then back at him, and something in her expression shifted in a way he could not name, but that made him want to ask what she was thinking. She did not tell him then. Instead she said, "Where would you like me to put the mare?" He showed her the barn. Her name was Matilda Elspeth Whitaker, and she was 26 years old, and she had come from a small town in Ohio called Hartwell, where her father had been a school teacher, and her mother had died when Matilda was 14. She had kept house for her father for years after that, and when he passed in the autumn of 1877, she had found herself alone in a house she could not afford, in a town that had never quite felt like hers, surrounded by people who knew her more by her circumstances than by herself. The matrimonial advertisement had caught her eye not because she was desperate, though she was practical enough to admit that desperation had played a role, but because something in the careful, honest language of the letter had sounded like a real person talking, not a man performing the idea of himself. She had packed what mattered into one trunk and a leather satchel, sold what she could, bought the mare from a farmer 2 towns over, and started west. She told Amos most of this across the kitchen table that first evening, while he made coffee on the cast iron stove, and she ate the bread and salt pork he put in front of her with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had been traveling too long to be self-conscious about hunger. He listened without interrupting. He was a man who had spent a great deal of time alone, and he had learned that silence was not something that needed to be filled every moment. "You are not what I expected," she said finally, wrapping both hands around the tin coffee cup. "What did you expect?" he asked. She considered it seriously. "Someone older, perhaps, or someone who expected me to be grateful." "You came a long way," he said. "That took courage. Gratitude seems like the wrong direction entirely." She looked at him steadily. "It does not bother you that I did not have many other options?" "I did not have many other options either," he said. "I do not think that makes the choice less real." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I will need some time to decide, to know you well enough to decide properly," she said. "I am not a woman who moves by impulse." "Neither am I," he said. "Take whatever time you need." She slept in the downstairs bedroom that first night, the one he had not claimed for himself, the one with the east window. He lay awake in his own room for a long time, listening to the prairie wind move against the house, thinking about the fact that there was another person breathing under this roof for the first time since he had raised the walls. The next morning she was up before him. He came downstairs to find her standing in the kitchen in her working clothes, a plain gray dress, her hair braided down her back, and she had already built the fire in the stove and was looking at the shelves where he kept his provisions with the focused expression of someone conducting an inventory. She turned when she heard him on the stairs. "You are nearly out of cornmeal," she said. "And you have no salt pork left, only what you put out last night. Your coffee supply is adequate for about 10 days. Do you go into Hays City regularly?" "Every 2 or 3 weeks," he said. "When is the next time?" "I was thinking Tuesday." "Good," she said. "I will write you a list." He almost smiled at that. He poured himself coffee from the pot she had already made and sat down at the table, and they talked about provisions and the state of the kitchen garden, which was just beginning to show, and he found that talking to her was easy in a way that caught him slightly off guard, the way stepping onto solid ground catches you off guard after a long time on water. He had a working cattle operation, 23 head at the moment, along with the 40 acres he planned to put into wheat that year. He had chickens and a mule named Sergeant who had the disposition of someone with a long-standing grudge against the world. He had a contract with the military post at Fort Hays for beef delivery every 2 months, which kept things stable enough, though stable was not the same as comfortable. Matilda proved herself useful in ways that were quiet and consistent, the best kind of useful. She was not showy about it. She took over the kitchen entirely within 3 days, not aggressively but naturally, the way water finds its level. She started the kitchen garden in earnest, adding rows of beans and squash to the sad few turnips he had planted without much conviction. She mended things that had been broken so long he had stopped seeing them. She had a habit of noticing what needed doing and doing it without announcing it, which was a quality Amos had not known he was waiting for but recognized immediately as valuable. He watched her carefully, not from suspicion, but from a genuine desire to understand who she was. He watched the way she moved through the mornings, efficiently but not hurried. The way she read in the evenings from the small collection of books she had brought in her trunk, holding the page up slightly toward the lamp, her lips sometimes moving just barely with a passage she found particularly good. The way she spoke to the bay mare, whose name turned out to be Bess, with a low, steady voice that was different from the voice she used with people, softer and more unguarded. Hays City in 1878 was a town in the business of being alive. It had come up fast on the railroad, the way Kansas towns did, and it had been rough in its early years, genuinely rough, with the violence that follows cattle drives and soldiers and whiskey in close proximity. By the time Amos had settled his land nearby, the worst of it had calmed somewhat, though the Long Branch on the main street still saw its share of trouble on Saturday nights, and the railroad had brought enough different kinds of people through that the town had a restless, provisional quality, like it was still making up its mind about itself. Amos drove Matilda into town on Tuesday, as promised. He watched her take it in, the wide dirt street, the wooden storefronts with their painted signs, the hitching rails crowded with horses, the smell of horses and fresh lumber and dust. She did not look overwhelmed, but she looked very attentive, the way she had looked at the farmhouse the first morning, like she was reading something. At Doonan's Mercantile, the proprietor Peter Doonan looked at Matilda with the undisguised curiosity of a man whose business depended on knowing everyone's business. "Mrs. Walker," he said, as though he already knew. "Miss Whitaker," she corrected, pleasantly but clearly. Doonan glanced at Amos. Amos said nothing. On the way back to the farm, the wagon loaded with supplies, Matilda said, "People will assume." "People always assume," Amos said. "It does not trouble me if it does not trouble you." "I only wanted to be accurate," she said. "That is a quality I respect," he said. The spring moved forward, and with it came the work of the season, which was relentless and concrete and left little room for complicated feelings, which Amos found was both a mercy and an inconvenience. He was out before sunrise most mornings checking on the cattle, making repairs to the fence line that the winter had broken in several places, beginning to plow the south field for wheat. Matilda managed the household and the garden and had begun, without being asked, to help with the smaller livestock tasks, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, managing the supply of corn for the mule. One afternoon in early April she appeared at the fence line where he was working, carrying a tin pail and a cloth. She handed both to him without comment. Inside the pail was water and 2 biscuits wrapped in a handkerchief. He was sweaty and tired and deeply grateful for both, and he ate standing at the fence post while she walked the line with him, looking at the places where the wire had snapped. "You need to restring about 40 feet along here," she said. "I know it," he he said. "I could help," she said. "I have held a wire spool before. My father's neighbor kept sheep." He looked at her sideways. She was not looking at him but at the fence, her hand resting on the post with the casual ease of a woman who was not afraid of physical work. There was a smear of garden soil on her right wrist. "All right," he said. They worked the fence line together for the rest of the afternoon, and it was good work, the kind where you do not need to talk much but the presence of another person makes it easier. They talked some, about nothing urgent, about the birds that were coming back now that the cold had let go, about the funny bad temper of Sergeant the mule, about the creek south of the property, and whether it would run high this year with the spring rains. When they walked back to the house together in the long pink evening light, Amos felt something settle in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and sure, the way the ground feels after you have been on horseback all day and your feet find the solid earth again. He named it to himself eventually, several days later, when he was alone at the south field and the wheat seed was going into the dirt and the sun was warm on his back. He was in love with her. He had not intended for it to happen this quickly, and he was not entirely certain what to do about it, because Matilda had come here in good faith and on practical terms, and he did not want to push her towards something she was not ready for or, worse, something she was doing only because she felt she had to. He resolved to say nothing and continue being useful and honest and present, which were the things he knew how to be. What he did not know was that Matilda was doing her own kind of accounting. She had been watching him the way she watched everything, carefully and without rushing to conclusions. She had noticed that he never spoke harshly, even when things went wrong, when a section of the barn roof started leaking and 3 feet of new shingle work came undone in an April storm. He had looked at it for a long moment and then gone to get the ladder without saying anything dramatic. She noticed that he kept his word in small things, which she believed was the truest test of character, bigger than keeping one's word in large things. He had said he would fix the hinge on the kitchen door by Friday, and he fixed it Thursday. He had said he would bring home a particular kind of thread from the mercantile, and he brought home 3 spools of it in the right color, having apparently asked Peter Doonan to look it up in the catalog. She noticed that he was lonely in a way that was old and quiet, not the sharp loneliness of someone who has recently lost someone, but the deep, persistent loneliness of a man who had been working towards something for a very long time without company. She had recognized it because she had the same thing in herself, in a different register. They were 2 people who had gotten good at being alone and were now cautiously, carefully discovering that they did not have to be. The thing that moved her most was something she had seen on a Sunday morning in late April, about 3 weeks after she arrived. She had been sitting on the porch with her coffee, and Amos had come out and stood at the porch railing looking out over the property in that way he had, steady and quiet, as though he were taking stock of something that mattered deeply to him. Then he had turned and looked at the house itself, the unfinished upper story, the bare wood, the framing exposed, and she had seen on his face something she could only describe as a man reckoning with the distance between where he was and where he had meant to be. She had almost said something then. Instead, she had held it inside and thought about it for days. In early May, a man named Cord Delaney came through the property. He was a cattle buyer from Dodge City, thick-set and loud, wearing a good coat and a self-satisfied expression. He had heard Amos might be willing to sell part of his herd and had ridden out specifically to make an offer. He arrived at the noon hour and accepted Amos's invitation to eat, and at the table he looked at Matilda with the particular kind of appraising look that some men give women they consider interchangeable with property. "Your wife makes a fine table," he said to Amos, not to Matilda. Amos put down his fork. He said calmly and without any theatrical weight, "Miss Whitaker runs this household with more sense and capability than most men I know manage in their whole operations, and she is sitting right in front of you if you care to tell her so directly." Cord Delaney blinked. He looked at Matilda, somewhat chastened. "My apologies, Miss Whitaker," he said. "It is an excellent dinner." "Thank you," Matilda said, in a tone that was pleasant and entirely impenetrable. After Delaney left, having concluded a sale of 5 head at a fair price, Matilda was washing the dinner dishes at the basin, and Amos was drying them beside her, which had become one of their daily rituals without either of them deciding it would be. She did not say anything about the exchange, but after a moment she handed him a plate and let her hand rest against his briefly, just for a second, before she pulled it back and reached for the next dish. He looked at her profile. She was looking at the window above the basin, at the afternoon light on the Kansas plain. He thought, "This woman is remarkable," and said nothing, because some things you let settle before you speak them. In June, Roy Alcott came by to help Amos start on the unfinished upper room of the house. Roy was 53, a former buffalo hunter who had turned farmer a decade ago when the herd started going and stayed, because he found he liked growing things more than killing them. He was a large, amiable man with a gray beard and an opinion on everything, delivered with the cheerfulness of someone who does not actually need you to agree. He had been Amos's closest neighbor for 6 years, and he had watched Amos build this house piece by piece the way you watch a river cut its channel, slowly and with certainty. Roy took one look at Matilda on his first visit and said, "Well, Amos, I believe you finally did something smart." Matilda had given Roy a very level look and said, "What was he doing before that was not smart?" Roy had laughed so hard he sat down on the porch step. After that, he adored her completely. The three of them worked on the upper room through June, Roy and Amos doing the heavy framing and shingling, while Matilda managed the boards and nails and kept track of what supplies they were burning through at what rate. She was methodical and precise, and when she found a calculation error in Amos's materials estimate that would have left them short on shingles, she said so without any fuss and adjusted the list for the next trip to town. During those long working days, something changed between Amos and Matilda. The work created a closeness that was different from the domestic closeness of shared meals and evening hours. This was side-by-side effort toward a shared purpose, and it was intoxicating in a very particular way. They communicated in the shorthand of people who have been paying close attention to each other, a look that meant hand me that, a tilt of the head that meant step back, a particular silence that meant both of them had noticed the same thing at the same moment. On an evening in mid-June, Roy had gone home, and the day's work was done, and they were sitting on the porch together in the cooling air, both tired in the satisfying way of people who have used themselves well. The upper room's framing was complete. The shingling would take another week. "It is going to be a fine house," Matilda said. Amos was looking at the upper story. "It should have been done 2 years ago," he said. "Why was it not?" He was quiet for a moment. "I kept finding reasons to wait. The barn needed repairing, the fence line. The cattle needed expansion before the house did, financially speaking." He paused. "Truthfully, I think I was waiting until I felt it was ready to be shared, not just structurally ready." She turned to look at him. The evening light was the color of wheat, warm and horizontal, and it caught the side of his face and made something of it that she found difficult to look away from. "Amos," she said, "yes, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as I mean it, which is plainly." "All right," he said. "I came here thinking I was making a practical decision," she said, "and I believe it was a practical decision, but it has also turned out to be something else, and I think it is right to say so." He was very still. "What has it turned out to be?" She looked back at the house. "I have been watching you for 2 months," she said, "not looking for flaws, though I looked for those too, looking for who you actually are." She took a breath. "You are a man who builds things with care because you believe they deserve care. You are a man who tells the truth even when something softer would be easier. You are a man who respects other people, which I did not take for granted. I have met men who do not." She stopped. "I am not made for pretty speeches, but I did not want to go much longer without telling you that I am glad I came here." Amos looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Matilda, yes, "I have been in love with you since the first week," he said. "I have been trying not to rush you." She looked at him. Something in her face, that careful, composed thing she kept over herself like a second skin, shifted and settled differently, and underneath it was something warmer and more open than he had seen from her before. "You have been doing a very poor job of hiding it," she said. "I thought I was being reasonable," he said. "You were being very reasonable," she said. "I only noticed anyway because I was already looking." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and sure. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over slightly so that her fingers interlaced with his, and they sat like that while the sun went all the way down over the Kansas plain and the first stars appeared overhead. He asked her to marry him on the last evening of June. He did it at the kitchen table after supper, without great ceremony, because he was not a man given to theater, and because he thought she would prefer honesty to performance. He said he loved her and he intended to go on building things and he wanted her to be the person he built them with, and that he knew they had not known each other long, but he was not a man who second-guessed something when he knew it to be right and true. She said yes before he had quite finished, and then she said, "You were rushing toward the end of that sentence." "I was nervous," he said. "You were nervous," she said, with a warmth in her voice that he felt in his whole chest. They were married in Hays City on a Saturday morning in July, at the small Methodist church on Main Street, with Roy Alcott as witness, and the Reverend James Poole officiating in his careful, deliberate way. Matilda wore her best dress, a dark blue calico that she had brought from Ohio and saved for something, though she had not known what until now. Amos had gotten a haircut and wore his good coat and stood at the front of the church with his hat in his hands and watched her walk toward him down the short aisle, and he thought that he had spent 7 years building something worth offering, and somehow the offer had been accepted by someone who exceeded anything he had thought to ask for. Afterward, Roy took them to dinner at the hotel restaurant, which was the most formal establishment in Hays City, and they ate beef and potatoes and biscuits, and Roy gave a toast with a glass of water because he had given up whiskey 3 years ago, and said he did not need it anymore. And the toast was long and sentimental and made Matilda laugh twice, and put her hand over her mouth to keep from laughing a third time, which was the most unguarded Amos had ever seen her, and it made him want to look at her for a very long time. On the drive home, the wagon rolling through the warm July night, she sat close beside him on the board, her shoulder against his arm. The stars were enormous out here on the flat land, the way they are only in places where there is nothing to interrupt the sky. She tilted her head up to look at them. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking that it is a long way from Ohio," she said, "but that distance feels like a fact now rather than a loss." He put his arm around her. She settled against his side naturally, as though she had always been there. The summer deepened, rich and hard-working, and full of the kind of days that you remember afterward, not because anything singular happened in them, but because they had a texture you could put your hands into. The wheat in the south field came up strong. The upper room of the house was finished in late July, properly roofed and floored and plastered, and Matilda claimed it for her own use, setting up her books and her small writing desk in the east corner, where the morning light came through the window. She had asked Amos to position just so. She began to write letters to a cousin in Pennsylvania who had corresponded with her since childhood, a woman named Bess, which caused a small comedy of confusion, because the mare was also named Bess, and Amos occasionally said the name in a context that made both of them pause before understanding which one was meant. Matilda eventually renamed the mare Della, which settled the matter. In August, a drought warning went around the county. The summer had been drier than usual in the last 6 weeks, and the creek south of the property had dropped. Amos moved the cattle to graze nearer the well and began hauling water for the garden, which was Matilda's domain, and which she had invested enormously in. She hauled water too, without complaint, though he could see the worry in the set of her shoulders when she looked at the bean rows going pale at the edges. He came up beside her one afternoon while she was examining the squash vines. "We will save most of it," he said. "The beans may not make it," she said. "Beans can be bought," he said. She looked at him, and he saw that it was not really about the beans. She was a person who had put great effort into something and was watching it suffer circumstances beyond her control, and that was a feeling that had its own particular grief separate from the practical loss. He understood it exactly. "We built it up from nothing," he said quietly. "We will rebuild what the dry takes." She nodded once, firmly. In the way she had, that meant she had accepted a difficult thing and was moving forward. The drought broke in September with 3 days of good rain that came in sideways off the northwest. Amos and Matilda stood on the porch on the second morning and watched it sheet across the south field and turn the creek back to running, and she laughed out loud with relief, a genuine, unguarded laugh that he had heard more of now that they were settled into their life together. He put his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, and they watched the rain together until they were both damp from the spray, and she said they had better go inside and make coffee. The autumn was good. The wheat harvest was not as full as he had hoped, between the late planting and the drought, but it was enough, and the cattle were fat going into fall, and he sold 8 head at Dodge City in October, making the trip with Roy and returning with money enough to put aside for the following year's planting, and the finishing work still needed around the property. He brought Matilda back a present from Dodge City. A small bottle of rose water from the dry goods, something she had mentioned once in passing, months ago, and he had remembered. She held it and looked at it for a moment with the expression she sometimes got when she was moved, and had decided to be quiet about it. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things you say," he told her. She set the bottle on the windowsill above the kitchen basin where the sun came through in the mornings. It stayed there all through the autumn, and he noticed that she used it carefully, sparingly, the way you use something that means more than its material weight. The winter of 1878 came in cold and still. They settled into the rhythms of winter on the plains, which were different from the rhythms of other seasons, quieter on the outside but interior in a way that suited them both. The evenings were long, and they filled them variously with work and reading and talk, the kind of talk that ranges widely, that touches on memory and ambition and small daily things and circles back and goes forward. He told her about his family in Virginia, his father who had died when Amos was 19, the brother who had gone west to California, and whom Amos had not heard from in 4 years. She told him about her childhood, her father's schoolroom, the smell of chalk dust and wood smoke, the lessons she had absorbed not just in letters and numbers but in the patience required to teach, which she had always thought must come from love. "Would you want to teach?" he asked one evening. "In Hayes City or nearby." She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about it," she said. "There is no school within a practical distance." "There could be," he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "There are children in this county with no teacher," he said. "The matter has been discussed. I have heard it from Roy, whose grandchildren are at his daughter's place south of here with no school to attend. If there were a teacher who wanted to establish something, there are men in the county who would help build and supply it." Matilda sat with this. She had the expression she got when she was running something seriously through her mind. "I am not a trained teacher," she said. "Your father was," Amos said, "and you have more books in this house than most institutions in this county." She picked up her coffee cup and set it down. "I would want to do it properly," she said. "You do not know how to do things any other way," he said. In the spring of 1879, Matilda Walker began to organize what would become the first schoolhouse in their part of Ellis County. She did it with the same quiet, methodical efficiency she brought to everything, writing letters to families within riding distance, taking a census of children's ages and present education levels, working with Amos and Roy, and 3 other men from nearby farms to raise a 1-room building on a flat piece of ground that Roy donated from the edge of his property, which was more centrally located than the Walker farm. Amos helped build the school the way he helped build everything, with his whole self and his best craft. He was proud of it, not just because his wife was going to teach in it, but because it was a real thing being put into the world, a thing that would matter to children who needed it, and that seemed to him one of the most concrete forms of good a person could do. The school opened in May 1879 with 11 children ranging from age 6 to 14. Matilda stood at the front of the room on the first day in her good dress, with the chalkboard Amos had built and hung for her behind her, and she looked at those 11 faces and felt something she recognized from a long way back, from her father's schoolroom and the smell of chalk, and the specific quality of a child's attention when they are about to learn something for the first time. She felt, with a completeness that surprised her, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She taught 3 days a week, which was what the families could manage in terms of having children away from their farm work, and she prepared her lessons on the evenings before each teaching day, sitting at her desk in the upper room while Amos worked at the kitchen table below, and sometimes he would hear her softly reciting something, a history date, a grammar rule, a line of verse, and it was one of the sounds that had become, without any fanfare, the sound of home. He told her so one evening. He was coming up the stairs to say good night and paused at the landing and said, "I can hear you reciting. It has become one of my favorite sounds in this house." She turned from her desk. "You are going sentimental," she said. "I am not," he said. "I am being accurate." She smiled at him, the full real smile that she had given more freely now that they were solid and settled, and held out her hand. He walked over and took it, and she pulled him down slightly to kiss him, brief and warm. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said, and went back downstairs and lay in the dark for a while, just feeling the good weight of his life. In early June of 1879, Matilda told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen with the directness that was characteristic of her, no preamble, just the information, and her eyes watching his face to see how he took it. He stood very still for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup, crossed to where she was standing, and put both hands gently on either side of her face. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Are you glad?" he asked. She covered his hands with hers. "I am very glad," she said. "Are you?" He could not quite speak for a moment, which was unusual for him. He nodded instead, and she laughed softly at his expression, and he pulled her into him and held her with a care that was different from ordinary care, attentive to something precious. The autumn of 1879 brought the child into the world. Roy Alcott's daughter, a capable woman named Prudence who had experience with births, came to the farm and stayed 2 days. The labor was long but not dangerous, and on the 2nd of October, 1879, a son was born to Amos and Matilda Walker. They named him Thomas, after Matilda's father, and Thomas Caleb Walker came into the world red-faced and loud and perfectly formed, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined expression. Amos held his son for the first time sitting in the chair beside the bed where Matilda lay exhausted and radiant, and he looked at this small face and felt something go through him that he could not have prepared for, a kind of love that was different in character from all other love, more primal, more staggering. He looked up at Matilda. "He has your eyes," he said. "He will have your character," she said, which he counted as one of the best things she had ever said to him. Thomas was a good baby, steady in temperament like his father, intensely curious like his mother. He observed the world with great seriousness from the very beginning, which Roy said meant he was going to be either a scholar or a judge, and probably both. Matilda resumed teaching in the new year, bringing Thomas with her to the school for the first months, where the older children took turns minding him with a devotion that amused and touched her. He became a kind of communal property of the schoolroom, and she thought it probably suited him, surrounded as he was from his first months by voices and learning. The Walker farm grew in the years that followed. 1880 brought a stronger wheat harvest than any previous year, and Amos expanded the cattle herd to 40 head. He and Roy built additional fencing, enclosing more of the south pasture. Matilda's school enrollment had grown to 19 children, and a second family, the Brannigan family who had come down from Nebraska, had two older children who were capable enough that Matilda began training the eldest daughter, Clara, as a teaching assistant. It was in 1880 that Amos finally built the last piece of the house that had been waiting. Along the west side he added a proper parlor, something Matilda had not asked for but that he had seen her making do without, a proper room for receiving visitors, for the evenings when the light was wrong for reading upstairs, for the Sunday afternoons that needed a different space than the kitchen. He built it himself mostly, with Roy helping on the heavy timber work, and he lined one wall with shelves for Matilda's books, which had multiplied considerably since her arrival, because he kept bringing her books from the Mercantile in Hays City whenever the new catalogs came in. When it was done, she walked through it twice without speaking, touching the shelves with her fingertips, looking at the window he had placed to catch the afternoon light. Then she turned to him and said, "This is the most beautiful room I have ever been in." "You are partial," he said. "I am accurate," she said, which was, of course, what he had said to her, and she said it deliberately, with the particular warmth of a shared reference that belongs only to two people. He laughed. He did not laugh easily, but she had always been able to make him, and it still pleased her every time. In the winter of 1880, they received a letter from Amos's brother Daniel in California. The letter was 3 months old by the time it arrived, its edges battered from travel. Daniel was alive and working in the timber business in the north of the state and had a wife and one child of his own. He had been trying to locate Amos for 2 years and had finally gotten an address through a man who had come through California from Kansas and happened to know the name Walker from Hays City. The letter was full of the careful, formal warmth of two brothers who have been strangers for too long and are trying to remember who they are to each other. Amos wrote back the same day. He wrote 3 pages, which was more than he had written to any person in a very long time. He described the farm and the wheat and the cattle. He described Thomas in some detail. He described Matilda last, and what he wrote about her he kept brief because he felt that brevity was the only honest measure of something that large. But he wrote that she was the best person he knew, and that she had come into a life that was almost finished being built and had made it make sense. Matilda read the letter before he sealed it, as he had offered. She read the last part and was quiet for a moment. "You wrote almost finished being built," she said. "Because it was," he said. "The upper room was not complete yet when you arrived. The parlor was years away." "I remember," she said. She folded the letter carefully and handed it back to him. "I remember the morning I arrived. You had just put in the porch railing. The upper floor was open framing." She paused. "I remember thinking that it did not matter." He looked at her. "I know what you were waiting for," she said. "I know you built it the way you built it because you wanted it to be ready. But Amos, it was already enough. It was enough because of what it came from. 7 years of the right intention shows in every board." She looked at the walls of the kitchen, which they knew the way you know the body of something you have lived in long enough to love. "I knew that the day I arrived. I knew it before I knew you." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the winter Kansas wind moved against the house, the low, persistent voice it had at this time of year, a sound that had frightened him a little in the first years out here and now simply sounded like weather. "I spent a great deal of time worrying that it would not be enough," he said. "I know you did," she said, "and now I am telling you it was." He sealed the letter. He reached across the table and took her hand. The 1880s moved forward. Thomas grew quickly, as children do, from baby to toddler to a small, serious boy who followed his father around the property asking questions, with a tenacity that Amos found both exhausting and wonderful. He wanted to know why the wheat grew in rows, why the cattle needed to be moved, why the stars did not fall, why the creek ran south. Matilda answered his questions with the patience and precision of a teacher, which she was, and Amos answered them with the patience and precision of a man who had spent years learning things by doing them, which he was. In 1882, Matilda had their second child, a daughter this time, born in July in the middle of a thunderstorm that shook the shutters and made the whole sky bright. They named her Ruth, and Ruth was the opposite of Thomas in most external ways, loud where he was quiet, eager where he was deliberate, light-haired where he was dark. But there was a stubbornness in both of them that came from the same place, from parents who believed that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing completely. The school continued to grow. By 1883, Matilda had 24 children enrolled, and Clara Brannigan was a full assistant by any measure, capable of teaching the younger grades entirely on her own. Matilda began to write to the county board about formalizing the school, getting it recognized, which would mean more support and eventually a proper schoolteacher's certification program for Clara. This required letters and meetings and the navigation of bureaucratic logic that had not been built with places like this in mind. But Matilda was patient and precise and completely unwilling to be redirected, which proved to be the most effective set of qualities for the task. Roy Alcott attended one of the county meetings with her as a supporting voice. He came back saying that Matilda Walker had talked 3 county commissioners into a position they had started the meeting firmly against, without ever raising her voice, which he considered one of the finest things he had ever witnessed in a civic setting. Amos, who had known for 5 years exactly what his wife was capable of, was not surprised. In 1883, something happened that tested them in a different way than weather or drought or slow bureaucratic resistance. A man named Harlan Pate, who owned a large cattle operation 20 miles south of Hays City, began pressuring the smaller farmers in the area to sell their land. He wanted the creek corridor, the water rights, and he was going about it in the way of men who have money and believe it can substitute for decency. He had visited 2 of Amos's closest neighbors with offers that were really ultimatums, and both had sold, one because he was old and tired, and the other because Pate's men had spent 2 weeks cutting his fence line in the night, and the man did not have the resources to keep repairing it. When Pate sent a man to the Walker farm, Matilda answered the door because Amos was out at the south pasture. The man, a well-dressed, smooth-talking fellow named Cray, delivered the offer in the language of reasonable business and opportunity, and Matilda listened to all of it with the expression she used for things that did not merit an emotional response. When he finished, she said, "Tell Mr. Pate that this land is not for sale. Tell him also that if his men are found on our property or at our fence line, the matter will be reported to the county sheriff and the territorial land office in Topeka. Good day." Cray blinked. He had not expected this. "Mrs. Walker, perhaps you should discuss it with your husband before. I am discussing it with you," she said. "The answer does not require my husband's amendment. Good day." She closed the door. When Amos came back, she told him all of it, plainly and in order. He listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "What exactly did you say to him?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw that he was pleased in the particular way he got when she had handled something completely well, the slight set of his jaw that meant he was containing something larger than he was going to express. "Good," he said. "Will he cause trouble?" she asked. "He may try," Amos said. "But Harlan Pate is a bully, and bullies generally look for easier ground when they run into resistance." He paused. "Roy still has all his land. The Marchetti place to the north has not sold. If we hold together, he cannot get the creek corridor, and without that it is not worth what he needs to spend." Amos spent the next week riding to every neighboring farm he was on good terms with, speaking plainly about the situation, organizing a collective agreement to hold land, and to report any fence cutting or intimidation to Sheriff Tom Dickerson in Hays City. 6 families held. 3 had already sold. But 6, positioned as they were, was enough to block Pate's plan for the water corridor. Pate sent Cray back to the Walker farm one more time, 2 weeks later, with a higher number. Amos answered the door this time. He listened politely. He said the land was not for sale at any number, because some things were worth more than their price, and he said good day and closed the door with the same quiet finality his wife had used, which he had noticed and respected and apparently filed away. They heard nothing more from Harlan Pate. Roy, when he heard the whole account, said this was one of the best stories he had heard in years, and then he repeated it to everyone he knew over the following months, with theatrical enhancements, until Amos and Matilda Walker had become something of a legend in the county, which neither of them had intended, and both found somewhat embarrassing. Thomas turned 5 in October 1884 and began attending his mother's school, which was strange and wonderful for both of them. Matilda had to be careful to give him no special treatment, and she managed it with characteristic fairness, treating him as she treated every other child in the room, which meant he received the same exacting standards she applied to everyone. He responded by being an excellent student, either because he genuinely was or because he understood from early on that his mother's professional pride was not something to trifle with. Ruth, at 2, was already running and attempting to manage every animal on the property, including Sergeant the mule, who was old now and had softened somewhat from his earlier misanthropy. She called him Sarge and talked to him at great length, and he tolerated her with a weary patience he had never extended to any other living thing, which Amos found amusing and slightly unbelievable. The mid-1880s were, on balance, good years. There were hard ones threaded through. A bad winter in 1885 that killed 6 of the cattle and required heroic fence work in brutal cold. A dry summer in 1886 that worried Matilda's garden deeply before a late August rain relented. But these were the ordinary difficulties of the life they had chosen, not catastrophes, and they met them the way they met everything together, practically, without catastrophizing or giving up. Daniel Walker came from California in the spring of 1886 with his wife Ellen and their son James, who was 6, and stayed 3 weeks. It was the first time Amos had seen his brother in 15 years, and the meeting was complicated in the way of long separations between people who still love each other, the strangeness of adult faces over memories of younger ones, the effort of learning who someone has become rather than assuming you already know. But Ellen was warm and capable and took to Matilda immediately in the way of 2 women who recognize each other as people of substance. And the 2 boys, Thomas and James, became friends within a day with the effortless speed of children. And by the end of 3 weeks it was a real visit, comfortable and full of laughter. Daniel told Amos on their last evening together, the 2 brothers sitting on the porch while their wives talked inside and the children ran somewhere in the last of the light, that he had thought of Amos often over the years, especially in the hard ones. "I wondered if you were all right out here," Daniel said. "I wondered the same about you," Amos said. "You ended up well," Daniel said. He looked at the farm, the south field, the barn, the solid limestone house with its new parlor and its yellow kitchen light visible through the windows. "Better than well." "I had to work for it," Amos said. "I know," Daniel said. "That is why it counts." They shook hands in the dark like the Virginians they had both been raised to be, and it was enough. After Daniel and Ellen and James left, Matilda came and stood with Amos on the porch in the evening, and they watched the road empty behind the departing wagon until it was just the road and the prairie and the enormous starry sky. "He is a good man," she said. "Your brother." "He is," Amos said. "You missed him." "Every year," he said. He said it simply, not dramatically, the way he spoke about things that were true and important. She put her arm through his and leaned against his shoulder. He put his hand over hers. "We will write more," she said. "Yes," he said. "We will." And they did. The correspondence with Daniel and Ellen became regular and warm over the following years, and it was one of the threads that made their life feel larger and more connected than the geography would otherwise allow. The summer of 1887 brought a particular kind of abundance. The wheat was excellent, the best in Amos's experience on this land, tall and golden and clean, and the harvest required bringing in 2 extra men to help with the cutting, which Amos paid in cash and meals. Matilda organized the meals with the same precision she brought to her school curriculum, and the men ate well and worked hard, and the wheat came in on schedule. The extra income from that harvest allowed Amos to pay off the last of the debt he had carried since buying additional cattle in 1881. He had carried it carefully, paying it down steadily, and the last payment was made in August to the bank in Hayes City. He came home that day and told Matilda in the kitchen, and she looked at him and said, "Tell me what that means." "It means it is all ours," he said. "Every acre, every board, nothing owed." She put down what she was doing and came to him and held his face in her hands the way he had held hers on the day she told him she was expecting Thomas. She looked at him carefully, the way she had always looked at him when something mattered, with the full attention of a woman who did not ration herself. "You built this," she said. "We built this," he said. She shook her head slightly. "You started it 7 years before I arrived. You built the foundation. I came in at the end." "You did not come in at the end," he said. "You came in before it was done, and then we finished it." He paused. "Together." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking, that particular quality of stillness she had when something was settling into place. "I remember," she said slowly, "the morning I pulled up to this house for the first time, I looked at it. The upper room was open, the porch was new, and I thought." She stopped. "What did you think?" he asked. "I thought it was already enough," she said quietly. "I thought this man built something real. It is not finished, but it is real, and it is already enough." She looked at him. "I should have told you that sooner." "You told me on the porch," he said. "That summer. You told me that it was enough because of what it came from." "I should have told you the day I arrived," she said. "You were strangers with me then," he said. "Even so," she said. She leaned forward and kissed him, not briefly, the way people kiss who have been married long enough to know exactly what they have. He put his arms around her and held her in the afternoon light of the kitchen, in the house that was entirely theirs, in the life that was entirely real. Thomas was 7 by this time, and Ruth was 5, and they were the kind of children who made the farm feel inhabited in a different and better way, their voices carrying from the barn or the garden or the edge of the south field, their presence making the house a place that was not only maintained but fully lived in. Thomas had his father's solidity and his mother's intelligence, a combination that made him frustrating in arguments and excellent in crises, as Amos noted to Matilda during one of their evening conversations. Ruth had an abundance of will that came from some deep personal source and a gift for animals that was genuinely unusual. She could calm a frightened horse with a quietness that grown men could not match, and she had decided at the age of 5 that she was going to be a veterinarian, having heard the word from a traveling doctor who came through Hayes City and explained his work. "Is that something women do?" she had asked Matilda. "Not yet in great numbers," Matilda had said. "But things that are not done yet are not the same as things that cannot be done. Do you understand the difference?" Ruth had thought about it. "Yes," she had said, and gone back to the barn with the air of someone who has received the information they needed and has no further questions. Amos and Matilda had laughed about this afterward in private, the quiet, helpless laughter of parents who are astonished and delighted by what they have raised. In the autumn of 1888, Matilda's school received its formal county recognition. The certificate was printed and framed, and Clara Brannigan, who was 22 by now, received her formal designation as assistant school teacher with pay from the County Education Fund, the first such position in the district. There was a small celebration at the school, attended by the families of the children and several people from Hayes City who had come to know Matilda's work over the years. Roy Alcott came, as he came to everything that mattered, and gave a toast that was even longer than the one at the wedding and made everyone laugh and several people cry, including Matilda, who cried quietly and with her chin up, the way she cried, as though weeping were something she was doing with dignity rather than being done by. Amos stood beside her during the toast and put his hand at the small of her back, and she leaned slightly into it without turning, and that was their private language for "I am here, and I am proud of you and I love you," conducted in the way they had always conducted such things, without needing to make it visible to anyone but themselves. 1889 brought a third child, another son, born in April when the Kansas sky was that particular blue of early spring, wide and clean. They named him Daniel, after Amos's brother, who sent a letter of such genuine happiness on receiving the news that Matilda read it twice and wrote back immediately with descriptions and details that filled 4 pages. Daniel Walker the younger was from the first a different kind of child than his siblings, louder in his laughter, more easily moved to tears, more openly affectionate, the kind of child who brings his whole self to every moment without reservation. He was also the one who woke most often at night as an infant, which provided Amos with many silent nighttime hours in the rocking chair in the kitchen, the baby against his shoulder, the farm quiet and dark around them, the stove ticking as it cooled. He did not mind those nights. He was a man who was comfortable with quiet, and there was something about those dark early morning hours that he valued, the heft of a sleeping child, the nearness of his family, the solid house around him that he had been building, was still building in the ways that mattered most. He would sit in the rocking chair and think about the road that had led here, the 7 years of solitary work, the land he had arrived on with $140 and a determined ignorance of what he was getting into, the soddy in the first years, the first stones of the foundation, the slow, patient work of making something from nothing. And then the morning when a wagon had appeared on the road, and a woman with dark hair and river water eyes and a particular quality of attention had stepped down into the Kansas dirt and looked at his almost finished house and stayed. He had spent 7 years building something worth offering, and she had arrived before he finished, and the thing she had said, which he had never forgotten and never would forget, was that it was already enough. He carried that. He carried it the way you carry things that are both weight and warmth, things that are too true and too important to be set down. By 1890, the Walker farm was one of the most established operations in its part of Ellis County. 48 head of cattle, 60 acres in wheat, a kitchen garden that supplied more than the family needed most years, and so supplied the neighbors the rest. A fine limestone farmhouse with a good parlor and a full east room, and a porch that had been repainted twice since Matilda had arrived and still faced east to catch the morning. A school with 26 children and 2 teachers. 3 children who were, by any reasonable measure, genuinely remarkable human beings in formation. Roy Alcott, at 65, had slowed down considerably and was not able to help much physically anymore. But he came to dinner every Sunday, which had been the arrangement since 1879 and had not varied. He sat at the table with the Walker family and ate whatever Matilda had made and contributed opinions on every subject, and held the small children on his lap, and told stories about the old buffalo hunting days that he framed very carefully now, conscious of what had been lost and lost and lost on these plains as the herds went, and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and the Comanche were pushed out of places that had been theirs since long before any settler came. It was a thing Roy talked about when he got older, the injustice of it, the enormity of what had been taken, and the smallness of any acknowledgement. Amos listened and agreed and thought that the land he had built on was also someone else's memory, and that knowing this did not change what had been done, but required that it not be forgotten. He said this to Thomas once, when Thomas was 9 or 10, the boy sitting on the fence watching his father work and asking questions. He said it plainly, that the land in Kansas had been lived on by people for a very long time before any settler arrived, that those people had been wronged in ways that were significant and serious, and that a person of good character had to be able to hold that truth alongside the love he had for his own home, and not pretend the one erased the other. Thomas had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "How do you hold both things?" "With difficulty," Amos had said, "but you hold them because honesty requires it." The boy had nodded and asked a different question, the way children do when they have received something that needs time to settle. In 1891, Ruth, who was 9, came to her father on a Sunday morning and asked if she could ride Della, who was old but still sound. He said yes and went out to help her saddle the mare, and watched his daughter ride out across the south field in the morning light, straight-backed and sure, the old bay moving underneath her with a steady cooperative patience that she had always reserved for Ruth specifically. He stood at the fence and watched them go and felt the particular kind of pride that is almost the same as grief because it is so large. Matilda appeared beside him. She had been watching from the porch. "She rides like you," Matilda said. "She rides better than me," he said. They watched Ruth reach the far end of the field and turn, and the old mare and the small straight-backed girl came back across the autumn grass together. "We have made a good life here," Matilda said. It was not a question. "We have made a great life," he said. He said it without qualification or hedging because it was true. She put her arm through his. The morning was cool and clear, and the Kansas sky was doing its particular wide thing, going all the way to the horizon in every direction, the grass still green in the low places where the creek ran, the wheat fields empty now and resting, the farmhouse behind them solid and warm with the smoke of the breakfast fire still rising from the chimney. "Do you remember," she said, "the letter you wrote to the matrimonial agency?" "I remember every word of it," he said. "You wrote that you had land and a home near completion," she said, "and that you believed a life built honest and shared was worth more than most things a man could chase." He nodded. "You were right," she said. He looked at her. In the morning light she looked as she always looked to him, which was like the most important person in any room he had ever been in, like the thing everything else was arranged around. She was 39 years old now, her dark hair touched with silver at the temples, her face worn pleasantly by years of sun and wind and life, her eyes as full of light as they had been the first morning on the road. "I did not know if anyone would answer," he said. "After I sent it I thought probably no one would." "I almost did not," she said. "I almost put the letter down and went back to Ohio. What stopped you?" She turned and looked at the farm, the old habit she had of reading it the way she had read it that first morning. "The part about the porch facing east," she said. "To catch the morning, I thought this is a man who thought about which direction the light comes from. That is a man worth answering." He laughed. It was a full, real laugh, the kind she had been drawing out of him for 13 years now, always surprising him slightly. "That is what did it," he said. "That is what did it," she confirmed. Ruth came back across the field and pulled up at the fence, her face bright with the cold air and the riding. "Papa," she said, "Della would go faster if you ask her properly." "You never ask her properly." "I ask Della exactly as properly as Della deserves," Amos said. "That is not very properly," Ruth said, and wheeled the old mare back toward the barn with the serene authority of a 9-year-old who has recently decided she is the foremost expert in her household. Matilda laughed. It was her best laugh, the one that started somewhere low and real, and Amos stood in the morning on the Kansas plain and listened to it and thought, with the uncomplicated clarity of a man who has been paying attention for 13 years, that this was the best sound the world had to offer. He reached over and took her hand. She held it. The morning light came across the field from the east, where the porch faced it, the way it had always come, gold and unhurried and ordinary and extraordinary, falling across the farm that he had built with his hands and his years and his stubborn, patient love. The farm that was no longer just his but theirs, the farm that was not just a building but a life, a real and complete and full life. Made of limestone and wheat and 3 particular children, and one woman who had driven a wagon down a dusty Kansas road in the spring of 1878 and looked at an almost finished house and known, before she knew anything else, that it was already enough. There were still things to build. There would always be things to build. The barn needed new siding on the north face. Thomas was asking about expanding the wheat acreage. Baby Daniel, who was 2 and extremely opinionated, had decided he wanted his own horse, which would be managed when he was rather older and somewhat less inclined to eat everything within reach. The school would keep growing, and there was talk of a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms. Roy was getting older and would need more help some days. There was always more to do, always the next thing, always the horizon. But the foundation was laid. The walls were solid. The roof held against the Kansas winter. The porch faced east, and every morning the light came. Amos Walker held his wife's hand in the autumn sunshine on the farm he had spent 7 years building, and he thought that whatever came next, it was all built on something true, something that had been tested by seasons and difficulty, and the long, honest work of two people choosing each other every day. He had wanted to offer her something worth having. She had arrived before it was finished and told him it was enough. And she had been right, as she usually was, about the things that mattered most. He lifted her hand and kissed the back of it, there in the morning in front of the farm, which was theirs and which was real and which was enough, more than enough, everything. She looked at him with the full warmth of her dark eyes, no guard over it now, no careful composure, just Matilda, just the woman she actually was, which was the finest thing he had ever been allowed to know. "Come inside," she said. "The coffee is going cold." "Yes," he said, and they walked back together to the house, and the door closed behind them, and the farm sat in the Kansas morning, solid and warm and whole.